welcome to this panel, panel 2. I'm really excited to chair this. Well done, Alison, it's a brilliant day. I'd like to introduce both of our speakers. We've got Dr. Maurice Casey, who'll be presenting the Leonhards, a family of refugee roots 1933 to 1945. Maurice Casey is a research fellow in HAP, right here at Queen's, and he works on the AHRC-funded project Queer Northern Ireland. This talk draws from his forthcoming book, which looks fantastic. If anyone's seen the cover, it's brilliant. Hotel Lux, An Intimate History of Communism's Forgotten Radicals, to be published in August this year by Footnote Press. He's joined by Niamh Cullen, Dr. Niamh Cullen, also from Queen's here, with her talk, Oh Fascism. Please excuse my pronunciation, is it juice? The Duÿ. The Duÿ, He Only Wanted Boys to Make War. The Politics of Maternal Love in Italy During Fascism and Afterwards. Dr. Niamh Cullen is a senior lecturer in modern history here at Queen's. She specialises in gender history, the history of emotions, and modern Italian history. Her most recent book is Love, Honour and Jealousy, An Intimate History of the Italian Economic Miracle. And the forthcoming translation of that is going to be released this year, 2024. Her recent work is mainly concerned with the history of motherhood, breastfeeding, and maternal love. Now, I will say that we'll do both talks, and then we'll save all questions for the end. And we're going to be aiming for about 30 minutes, as indicated by this incredible clock. All right, fantastic. Maurice.
Thanks so much, Livy, and thanks so much to Ruth and Alison for inviting me to talk. So I hope you'll forgive me if I begin just with a little sales pitch. My book comes out in late August. It comes out around the same time as Sally Rooney's new book. So you could help me by spreading the notion that this is the literary Barbenheimer, that you go and you get both of them together. And my talk today draws on a central strand, a central story in my book. The book is a history of Moscow's Hotel Lux, which was the dormitory of the Communist International, and it tells the history of the hotel through the interlocking lives of three families. And so today in this talk, I'm going to be speaking about one of those families, the Leonhard family, who were a Dutch-German family, and I'm particularly going to be focusing on their own private family archive and one particular source that I found within that archive. So the book's available to pre-order. I'll come back to that note at the end. So I'm going to frame this around three questions. I'll begin talking about how did I find the Leonhard family and who were they? I'm going to then talk about how did the family who held dangerous identities as German socialists and members of a resistance network survive the 1930s. The father of the family was in fact on a SS blacklist. And thirdly, how did the family archive survive given the family's need to constantly move through the European refugee networks? So those questions are not really a strictly chronological framing, they all kind of interact with one another in the talk. And overall, while I've specifically written my PhD book as a trade book because I want to tell it in a certain narrative form. So I'm here more than all to tell you a story, but there is an argument, there are ideas, and I am particularly interested in exploring the survival stories of documents and archives that survive outside of formal institutional archives. And I'm also interested in thinking about and discussing the desire paths that historians take through the archive and how each story arises out of another. And that mixture of, intuition, expertise, and serendipity that shapes our work. So actually this project, or this family, is the bridge between my book project and what I hope is my next project. So let's begin our story where all of my stories of my book begin, which is in Moscow's Hotel Lux. The first time I came upon the family Leonhard was through my research into this hotel. It was the dormitory of the Comintern, converted into that in 1921. Originally, it was a boutique hotel belonging to Moscow baking dynasty. It's a familiar name to historians of communism. Many of the movement's most famous figures spent time living there: Ho Chi Minh, Tito, Antonio Gramsci, and other similar famous revolutionaries. My introduction point to the hotel was through the life of an Irish woman named Mayo Callaghan, who worked as a translator in the Comintern during the mid-1920s. She lived in room 5, which is one of the front-facing rooms on the ground floor in these postcards. And in the summer of 1925, just under a year into her time in the Lux, Mayo Callaghan's friend, a German revolutionary, went into labour in the hotel. May summoned the taxi to bring her friend to the Kremlin hospital, and that friend's name was Emmy Leonhard. So I found Emmy Leonhard through this friendship and through looking into the life of Mayo Callaghan. She was actually born Alida Emmy von Keimerer. She dropped the first name Alida and the aristocratic surname von Keimerer to adopt the revolutionary name Leonhard shortly after leaving home in 1915. She was born into enormous wealth and to a banking family in Hamburg, hence the fact that I have family photographs charting her at every stage of her life. But when she left behind the palatial family home in her early 20s, she became involved in left-wing circles, was eventually one of the first women elected to the Hamburg parliament as a member of the SPD in 1918. Moving leftwards, after 1918, she joined the German Communist Party, the KPD, and she also gained a role as a translator in trade union congresses in Amsterdam. And it was likely through this work that she would meet her life partner, Duÿpy. When Edo and Emmy met, Edo was already internationally known in trade union circles as the Dutch General Secretary of the powerful International Transport Workers Federation. In the 1930s, he guided one of the most durable and impactful left-wing anti-resistance networks operating both within and beyond Nazi Germany. When Emmy met Edo around 1921, he was almost a decade her senior and already married with 2 children. Estranged from his wife, whom he never legally divorced, something that would have impacts on Emmy, Edo began a relationship with Emmy that lasted until his death and produced 2 daughters, Elisa, the girl born in the Kremlin hospital in May 1925, and Alida, born in Berlin in 1928. So this photograph here shows Edo, Emmy, and Elisa. It's the only photograph I have that depicts Edo and Emmy together. So when I discovered Emmy Leonhard's name, I discovered when you research her and look through her name in Google book searches, she almost inevitably appears as listed as the partner of Duÿpy in various historiographies of interwar trade unionism. So I decided, or I intuited, that the way of recreating her life would be to find her and kind of trace her in the archival sediment of Duÿpy. So, of course, I started with Duÿpy's own archive, the majority of which is held in the Modern Records Centre in the University of Warwick. But when I went there, I realised that precisely the kind of documents that I was interested in, those personal family documents, had in fact been taken out of the archive. So Elisa, Edo and Emmy's first daughter, had visited the ITF headquarters in 1971. She had looked through the archive for personal documents and she had taken them with her. So exactly the kind of records I was searching for had existed, I realised, but if they still did, they were likely held privately. I had also learned by this point that Emmy and Edo had one grandson, Pierre, born to their youngest daughter, Alida, in 1970. I could not find him, although I Facebook messaged every person with his name, and I decided instead to see if he might find me. Using skills that I picked up during a soul-crushing internship at a digital marketing firm, I created a blog post that was search engine optimized so that anyone searching for info on this family would come across my website. Pierre, the grandson, did not find me, but René, an older gentleman living in Frankfurt, did. One afternoon in 2017, I received an email with Emmy's name as the subject line, and rarely has the Outlook notification rung out more beautifully. In the email, René told me how he had found my website while doing family history research. His father, Erwin, was an active member of the German Trotskyist movement before the Nazi rise to power, and Erwin considered Emmy to be his political mentor. Rennie told me more about Emmy's world in Berlin, which she returned to from Moscow in 1926. She left behind the Orthodox German communists and joined the Trotskyist opposition. In 1933, she, like Rennie's father Erwin, fled Germany following the Nazi takeover. And that is the story behind the tear on the bottom of this photograph, a scan of which Rennie attached in his initial email. This is a picture of Emmy and Edo's two daughters, Alida, the younger one, on the left, and Elisa on the right. Emmy tore this photo in half and gave this half to Rennie's father Erwin. She kept the other half, and while the two activists made their way through a perilous time in Berlin's history, she told Erwin that he could flash this photograph to her as a silent signal of danger. But for all that Rennie could tell me, he did not have an answer to the question that pressed me most: what had become of Pierre? The answer to that question I found in the acknowledgement section of a biography of Ruth Dreyfus, the first woman president of Switzerland. The journalist who wrote it thanked Pierre's mother Alida for providing information. On Facebook, I messaged Isabella officially and asked her if she knew anything more of the family. 3 years later, she finally saw the message and replied. Although that she did not have any contact with the family anymore, she thought that Ruth Dreyfus might. And so that's how I came to email a former president of Switzerland to ask if she knew anything about the grandson of an obscure German Trotskyist. And it turned out she did. With the help of Ruth Dreyfus, I finally tracked down Pierre, who is now known as Pedro and living in a fishing village on the Galician coast. In August 2021, I travelled there and finally met someone whose personal history was interwoven with that of Emmy and Edo. One of the more striking moments for me was my first encounter with Pedro, because I immediately realised how similar he looked to a younger, leaner Edo. Pedro, it turned out, had both inherited and maintained vast amounts of family documents, and together we spent a week in his villa on the northern Spanish coast going through the material. There was one set of documents that truly astounded me, and remains the most extraordinary primary source find of my career. Before I arrived, Pedro had given me some hints towards it, but nothing could compare to holding the real thing in my hands. It turned out that every fortnight from late 1935 until mid-1940, Pedro's mother Alida and her older sister Elisa had illustrated and handcrafted a newspaper charting their lives as the children of anti-Nazi exiles. Several hundred pages of the journal had survived, and it was all sitting a 3-minute walk from the Atlantic Ocean. So, to give you an example of how this was structured, that front cartoon you see there on the forward-facing issue is an image, and the caption, it's Joseph Stalin looking at a member of the NKVD, and Joseph Stalin asks, "Which of the Bolsheviks of November 1917 have I not yet shot? You, Comrade Stalin," the commissar replies. So in these yellowing pages, I found a skeleton key that unlocked the solution to a major research dilemma for those of us who work on refugee families: how to trace the life of a family who, by merit of the real political dangers they faced, constantly had to dispose of their documents. The Leonhard family archive disappeared twice, first in 1934 when the Gestapo turned over the Potsdam apartment that the family abandoned, and again in early 1940 when Emmy took all of her letters, placed them in a metal container, and buried that container in the back garden of a summer home owned by the French philosopher Simone Weil. So that's an image of that's a drawing from the Alpenpost of them burying their family archive. Yet hundreds of pages of this journal had survived. How? The answer lies in the reason for the journal's existence. Edo's role as a guiding light of one of the largest European anti-fascist underground networks kept him away from his family for extended periods, indeed for most of the 1930s. So pictured here is a secret communication between Edo and a minister in the Spanish Republican government, and it gestures towards the role, now largely forgotten, that Edo and his large network of collaborators held throughout the 1930s in their attempt to play an active and militant role in the fight against fascism. Amidst all of this activity, Edo kept up to date with his family through the Alpenpost and preserved each issue, likely in the Amsterdam headquarters of his union. When the ITF evacuated to Britain in 1939, he took the entirety of the Alpenpost with him, eventually bringing it to Mexico in 1940, where it remained until the end of World War II, before returning to Europe back in the possession of the two women who had written it. And so for the rest of my contribution, I'd like to explore what this source can tell us about familial life and love on the eve of a cataclysm that the Leonhard family was actively trying to prevent. First, a word on layout and structure. The Alpen Post always maintained that it was nothing less than a serious paper. Each issue was dated and numbered. Citations or copied illustrations always credited their sources, and the two girls who wrote it, Elisa and Alida, who were respectively, Elisa, they would have been 10 when they started it and about 15 when they finished, and Alida was 2 years younger than her. But in each issue, internally within the text, they always referred to themselves within the text of the paper as the editorial team, or in German, die Redaktion. The Alpen Post had two titles. The first reflected its alpine place of publication, the town of Montana in the Swiss canton of Vermala, where Emmy, Elisa, and Lida spent their first years of exile after fleeing Germany in 1933. And later, when they moved to France, it became titled La Guinguette, or the Little Tavern. The two girls, as you can surmise, had an unusual childhood, and something that was reflected in how the Alpen Post covered international events. Pictured on the left is the cover for the 13th September 1936 issue, with a lead article written by Elisa titled Just Like Us. The article written by Elisa reflected on a memory of attending a Trotskyist meeting in Berlin with her mother. Bored by the meeting, Elisa began dismantling a toy car, leading the chair of the party, Kurt Landau, to joke that she was a little anarchist. Across from her, Elisa remembered, was a Latvian student by the name of Valentin Olberg, who argued with her mother, Emmy. Historians consider Olberg almost certainly a Soviet intelligence agent tasked with infiltrating left opposition groups, and his service was rewarded through his recall to the USSR and eventual placement as one of the defendants in the first of Stalin's show trials. If we look at the date of the article, we can see that Elisa is writing this as the show trials are underway. Clearly, she had recognized Olberg in news reports or overheard her mother speaking about him. And all of this gestures towards the extraordinary nature of the Alpen Post as a source. How rarely do we find surviving reflective pieces written by the young daughters of revolutionaries during this period. Yet it also reflects what is notable historiographically about this family, particularly thinking through political histories of intimacy. Edo was not a communist. He was a social democrat of the kind that Emmy's nominal leader, Leon Trotsky, regularly denounced. And yet their partnership worked, was lasting, and was durable, and they both admired each other's political stances. Another feature, of course, are Elisa's illustrations, which I'll touch on briefly here. Elisa always did the more ornate drawings. These are two typical examples of the kind of political illustrations that appeared. The first, an anti-Nazi drawing from 1938, and the second reflecting the Chinese Red Army's advances in its drawn-out civil war. Much, if not most, of the Alpen Post coverage, however, was dedicated to documenting family life. There were birthdays to mark, such as this special 1939 issue marking Edo's 58th birthday. So you can see Elisa on the left and Alida on the right presenting flowers to Edo, who's the king of the ITF. Or regularly updating Edo on family happenings or celebrating his either coming or going when he would visit them either in Switzerland or in Paris. There are also things like a puzzle page, a humour column, and a review section where the children assess their mother's cleaning, cooking, and teaching. Another thread of the paper are events and people related as quotidian, but which us historians with hindsight can read to be extraordinary. In 1934, in the first year of their exile in Switzerland, the Leonhard family made a remarkable friend. That year, Emmy had been reading La Révolution Prolétarienne, a French journal formed by defectors from the Communist Party that aired various dissident communist, anarchist, and syndicalist views. In this journal, she came across the writings of the philosopher Simone Weil and was so taken by Weil's insights that she wrote to the editors to start a correspondence with the young French intellectual. By an astonishing coincidence, right as she wrote the letter, Simone Weil was staying in the exact same Swiss town where Emmy and her two daughters were living. She had been sent there by her worried parents to recover from an ear infection. It was the beginning of a deep bond between the Leonhard and Weil families and set the stage for the next move after Switzerland and the Alpen Post's second incarnation. In 1938, Selma and Bernard Vey, parents of Simone, offered Simone and the girls their summer home south of Paris in the town of Chevreuse. The home was called La Guinguette, or Little Tavern, and the children chose this as the new title of their newspaper upon relocating to France. This regular feature of the paper, a fortnightly roundup of family and world events, gives a sense of the children's life. There's news of the pets, their mother's birthday, and a homeschool lesson from one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. France, as a means of relocating from Switzerland, was likely chosen to help the family remain closer to Edo. Although he was always headquartered in Amsterdam, he had far more reason to be in Paris than Switzerland, given its importance within anti-fascist networks. From 1936, the French border with Spain became an important crossing point for operatives within Edo's networks, while Paris itself was home to a sizable community of both German and Italian anti-fascist exiles. Of particular importance to Edo's activities were the two Willys, Willy Eichler, chair of the ISK, a sect-like and defined group of Esperanto-speaking anti-Nazi vegetarians, and the better-known Willy Munzenberg, one-time guiding light of the Comintern's cultural activities, but from 1937 cast out of the party. Munzenberg and his wife Babette Gross, pictured here on the left, became particularly close to Emmy and the two girls and featured regularly in the children's newspaper. So this on the right is a drawing from La Guinguette showing Willy Munzenberg and Babette Gross waiting outside an office as the family's, Leonhard family's visa status was considered. Like any refugee family, citizenship was an important factor that determined their lives. Legally speaking, both Elisa and Alida were illegitimate, a legal category that existed in much of 20th century Europe until late into the 20th century. Edo never divorced his wife and thus never married Emmy. Had he done so, Emmy would have received something vitally important, the loss of her German citizenship and the assumption of Edo's Dutch citizenship. As war grew closer, a war that Edo was convinced from the 1933 onwards was going to come, the danger of being a German and an anti-Nazi German became clear. Emmy and Edo knew that in the event of a German invasion of France, Emmy was likely to be interned as a German national. To avoid this, Edo arranged for one of his Dutch comrades, Daniel de Jager, to marry Emmy and also to perjure himself by claiming before a French court that Elisa and Alida were his natural-born daughters. This is the special marriage number of La Guinguette that tells the story of this marriage. The scheme worked and would prove foresighted in the coming months. With the declaration of war, Emmy, Elisa and Alida became intent on joining Edo in Britain, where the ITF had relocated to new headquarters in rural Bedfordshire. Shortly before the war broke out, Edo suffered a stroke and thus was largely bedbound in England. Such worries for his health only made the family more anxious for a more stable reunion. This page of La Guinguette, published shortly after the outbreak of the war, announces the journal's adoption of military censorship. In March 1940, Edo and the ITF arranged clearance through contacts in the British government for his family to join him in Britain. The two girls produced a special edition of their paper, a 4-page comic strip that recounted panel by panel the journey from outside Paris all the way across the Channel to their reunion with Edo in England. And you can see here Babette Gross helping the family bring their animals to a refuge, and in Paris saying goodbye to Selma Vey. Reunion, when it came, was bittersweet, for Edo was now much diminished and could sense that he was, at the age of 61, approaching the final act of his energetic life. The children's journal appeared in one final edition, an issue dedicated to describing the social world of anti-Nazi exiles that they lived alongside in Bedfordshire. The ITF and Emmy made a decision to move Edo to Mexico rather than have him remain in England and face into a winter of wartime rationing. So at the end of 1940, the family made their first and final relocation altogether, eventually settling in Cuernavaca, a Mexican city with a large population of Spanish Republican exiles, many of whom knew and respected Edo from his anti-fascist work. Edo died in, so that's the final panel of the journal. Edo died in December 1942. That's a picture of him and Elisa and Lida on the left in Mexico. In his final years, when they were reunited, Emmy took over much of his work, including arranging for the evacuation of Spanish anti-fascists from North Africa to Mexico. She also maintained his correspondence, in addition to continuing to care for their two now teenage daughters, and tried also to keep up, to update him on the fates of many of his anti-colonial comrades, including Muhammad Hatta and Nehru, who he had met through his anti-colonial work in the 1920s. Emmy continued to be an independent political thinker and developed towards anarchism. In a February 1943 notebook, the Russo-French revolutionary Victor Serge wrote of an encounter with Emmy, describing her face peaceful beneath white hair, the gaze and speech of an old enthusiastic militant thinking ceaselessly of her return to Europe in revolution. Emmy did return to Europe in 1945, although not to a continent in revolution. Along with her two daughters, she returned to their first site of exile, Switzerland, settling in a town called Tannay outside Geneva. She became involved in the European community of municipalities and played a role in encouraging town twinning programs. She used her German reparations payments to fund a utopian play that she published towards the end of her life called Tomorrow, which outlined a world where states were replaced by small-scale councils and where international currency was replaced by a system where you could exchange hours worked for goods and services. And she maintained her friendships with other survivors of the exile routes and died in 1976. The last published work was a letter she wrote to the editor of an anarchist journal complaining that they hadn't sufficiently welcomed the American defeat in the Vietnam War. Elisa, Emmy and Edo's two daughters, Elisa and Lida, very much mirrored their parents' own dynamic. Elisa, taking after her mother, was the philosopher, utopian and dreamer. She lived with her mother until Emmy's death and worked with the UN headquarters in Geneva. After her mother's death, she took up a UN role in Jerusalem, where she died in 1992. Among her personal papers, I found many notebooks of poems, aphorisms, and philosophical thoughts, handwritten on scraps of papers too. I've not had the time nor the French language ability to analyse them in detail, but this page is an example of their tone. If you don't like these pages, blame me. Like most of you, I couldn't keep my mouth shut, not even on paper. If you find them worthy of some consideration, praise my mother. She made me as I am, and her ancestors who made her as she is. Like her father, there's a slight error here. She died in 2010, not the same year as her sister. Like her father, young Alida became an organiser. She rose from a janitorial role at the Geneva offices of the International Rescue Committee to becoming one of its leading figures in Switzerland. She became heavily involved in refugee work during the Cold War era and had numerous international postings. She spent her last years in England, a choice she made to be close to the site she remembered so fondly from her childhood, the location of her reunion with her father, Edo. This photograph, sent to me by the aforementioned René Dumont, is a useful encapsulation of her life. Here is Alida in her early 20s, the product of a refugee childhood, overseeing a reception camp for Germans who had been active in the resistance and who were awaiting a return to a country in ruins. Both daughters kept the name de Jager throughout their lives, a mark of respect to the man who had married their mother and perjured himself to legally adopt them, therefore rescuing them from the perils of German citizenship. So I wanted to end this paper, like I do my book, with a page from the Children's Journal. This comic, from one of the last issues, charts each stage of the family's journey from Germany to England from 1933 to 1940. The newspaper only survives because of the ways in which affect shapes the archive. The newspaper was created by two children for their father, separated from them due to the necessities of dangerous work and the paroxysms of the 1930s. Their father kept safe every issue, even when he and his organisation was forced to evacuate ahead of a coming war. The newspaper then survived within the family, maintained by the ties of love and familial connection that connected one generation with the next. You could say I was fortunate to discover these sources, but fortune is a dull way of flattening a more interesting reality. To write the kind of intimate history I wanted to foreground in my book, the history of how family and romantic life was shaped by a commitment to a revolutionary cause, I needed to follow a desire path through the archival debris of international communism, moving off the approved routes of party archives and the personal papers of prominent individuals to instead attempt to trace as many living descendants as I could. In this and all of my work, I embrace a sense of archival possibility and a fundamental belief, guided not by faith but by evidence, that ordinary human bonds often preserve the most interesting material within family archives. Family archives are structured by different desires than those of parties, states, and institutions. More simply, they are more often shaped by love. Any history of love and war is more difficult to chart when we write it without them. And so, to end, this is my final sales pitch. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, that was so amazing. I don't know about you, but none of my archival research ever takes me to Spanish villas. So I'm really jealous. Fantastic. We'll hold all the questions until the end. So I'm going to welcome Niamh Cullen. Thank you.
Great, thanks. With this paper, like Mars, I'm looking at love in families rather than romantic or sexual love. But what I'm really interested in primarily is love as a sort of idea, as a political idea, as a sort of an idea with a politics and a history. And I'm going to be looking at sort of how maternal love in particular operated politically in Italy. And my primary focus will be, as I said, on the sort of politics and the idea of love rather than on sort of actual experiences, although I will spend a little bit of time considering how these ideas fitted with experiences in the final part of the paper, and as we'll see, they didn't fit very well. War is also, it's an important framing device for the discussion, both the two world wars and also the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. But rather than focusing on any particular conflict, I'm interested more in the longer term reverberations of the way in which war structured how family was understood. So the discussion, it begins roughly in the 20s and focuses a lot on the 30s, but it doesn't end with the fall of fascism. It also traces the continuities and the echoes of fascist rhetoric about mothers in the post-45 decades. So my primary focus, as I said, is the idea of maternal love. And I look at it as discussed in magazines and memoirs and novels, as well as its representation in official documents and imagery. So in fascist Italy, motherhood was highly politicized, as women were encouraged to have large families to produce children for future armies. And the regime tapped into the pre-existing Catholic and sentimental iconography of motherhood to produce a kind of emotional politics that conflated a mother's love for her son with love for country. And this paper examines, as I said, about the official appropriation of this discourse of maternal love, but also looks at the ways of different groups of women responded, highlighting the gulf between the official fascist rhetoric and actual experience. So the deeply intimate ways in which love is experienced in body and in mind, and how it's also understood and communicated between mothers and children, lies largely beyond the scope of the discussion. But at the same time, I think such an investigation does cast light on the role of emotions in negotiating the interplay between public and private selves in an authoritarian regime, and also the shifting relationship between family and state, both during and after fascism. So during the First World War, the love between mothers and sons came to have public and national significance in many places. And it symbolized the sacrifice and the endurance necessary for the war effort. So historians have examined this kind of discourse in many places. Claudius Siebrecht, for example, examines the public discourse about maternal love, duty, and grief in wartime Germany, particularly as it's expressed through art and monuments. While in Italy, the historian Marina Duwiąy does the same. And I've drawn her work quite a bit for the fascist period. So it was considered the duty of patriotic mothers to basically essentially allow or to persuade their sons to enlist and thus be prepared to make what was seen as the ultimate sacrifice. In wartime, of course, as we've got a sense of already, love was inseparable from loss and grief. And we can see in Duvoily's work, she looks at the diaries and the letters of patriotic Italian mothers, which reveal these internal struggles that many women felt between duty to the nation and maternal love. And indeed, we also see a discourse developing in Italy where there's a suspicion and a scorn of maternal love among patriotic intellectuals. For example, a man whose mother didn't wish him to enlist was considered to be, this is a quote, a prisoner of maternal love. And such negative attitudes blended into the suspicion that mothers might be more loyal to their children than the state. In Germany, Siebrecht shows how the motif of the mourning mother, heavily inflected with Christian and Marian symbolism, the form of the Mater Dolorosa sort of iconography, became key to the work of patriotic German women artists. So women's grief was given political meaning everywhere. And this motif of the mourning mother took shape as sort of the ultimate sacrifice of patriotism. But it was in Italy that this idea was given a particular state recognition. So the image that I've shown on the slide there shows what's called a monument to the mother. So this monument was unveiled in 1926, and it's still in. You can view it in the Santa Croce Cathedral in Florence. And it's as you can see, it's a sort of modernist, and it's considered a somewhat sort of mediocre Pieta-style sculpture. It's not sort of any great or original work of art, I think. But it is interesting for its political significance. So the idea for the monument originated in the activism of a group of mourning mothers. But by the time the sculpture was completed in 1926, the fascist regime had been in place for some years. And by this time, the monument was incorporated into the official sort of narrative and iconography of the newly established fascist regime. So maternal grief was sort of co-opted by the state. And the suspicion of excess emotion of Italian mothers, this idea that mothers might be more loyal to their children than the state, it also likely fed into the family politics and the reactionary gender politics of the new fascist regime. So ruling from Italy's not very impressive military performance in World War I, Mussolini, a key part of the fascist program was this desire to shape Italian men into proper soldiers. And the ideal fascist woman was meant to sort of complement this ideal soldier man. So the ideal fascist woman would be a wife and a mother. She would be feminine and submissive. But she was also not completely traditional because the fascist regime gave motherhood a new political significance. As Mussolini famously said, he said, he's supposed to have said, war is to man what maternity is to woman. So motherhood was the political role of women under the regime. Of course, it was also mothers of sons who were given this particular status and purpose under fascism. There's very little public mention of mothers and daughters. The state, because motherhood was considered a political role, the state also felt a need to train women to be modern, or to be model patriotic mothers. So women were expected to sort of fulfill their sort of so-called natural, so-called traditional roles up to a point, but they also needed to be trained. So although it built on sentimental Catholic and patriotic images and rhetoric, the various fascist organizations and initiatives also aimed to reschool women away from a conception of motherhood as essentially intimate, private and familial, and towards one that was situated more in the realm of the modern state and factory. Motherhood essentially as a sort of sentimentalized mass production, you might say. So this training of mothers was in part practical and medical. After 1918, there was a concerted aim in Italy, as across Europe, to raise the national birth rate. And one of Mussolini's first policy initiatives was what he called the Battle for Birth, so a campaign to raise the birth rate through incentives, subsidies, and prizes for mothers of large families. Since infant mortality was comparatively high, official attention was also concentrated on supporting and training mothers in the health and the hygiene and proper nutrition of infants. The National Organization for Maternity and Infancy, which is usually referred to by the acronym UNMI, was set up in 1925 and it had the primary aim of providing information, support and training for pregnant women and mothers. It also provided limited daycare provision for poor and single working mothers, while the existing network of Catholic-run foundling homes and orphanages were also incorporated into the Omni structures. The regime also ran what they called a campaign against illegitimacy. This was aimed at combating social stigma and encouraging single mothers to keep their children. It was quite a different approach to single mothers than we might see in Catholic and state institutions in the 20th century in, say, Ireland and Spain. Because rather than separating children from unsuitable mothers, the regime aimed instead to train all women to mother in the proper, and that is Catholic and fascist manner. There was also particular emphasis on breastfeeding. But at the same time, women were schooled not to trust their own instincts. The early 20th century saw a notion of scientific mothering, as it's known, adopted across the US and Western Europe. And great importance was placed on essentially feeding schedules and weight measurements. And in Italy, double weighing, that is weighing a baby before and after a feed to check exactly how much milk they're taking in, was recommended. So these schedules and measurements, they were used elsewhere, they're not unique to Italy, but the care of babies was uniquely politicized in Italy. So the historian Diana Garvin has described how fascist newsreels promoted what she called tailorized breastfeeding. And that's what you can see in the image on the slide there. What I've done is I've just taken a still from one of these newsreels. You don't need to see the whole thing to get the idea of what it looks like. So only a small minority of women would have experienced this kind of regimented factory-style feeding, although the newsreels were intended for wider viewing. And they highlighted both how the regime combined modernity, that is cleanliness and efficiency, and a sort of mass production, essentially, of childcare with tradition, and also how the private sphere of the family was subordinate to the fascist state. In 1933, the first National Day of the Mother and Child took place on the 24th of December. So Mother's Day does have a longer history in other nations like the US, the UK, Germany, and France. But in Italy, it was associated from the start with fascist policy. So an article in the Catholic magazine, just picture the cover on the slide there. The magazine is called Vita and Pensiero, so life and thought. And they ran an article in, as you can see, December 1933, just underlining the linking of this new national day to Christmas and sort of celebrating the way that the fascist regime was valorizing motherhood. So as you can see, the quote sort of uses a lot of this very sentimental language, as you can see. So it says, It is so sweet and suggestive that the 24th of December has been chosen to celebrate this new national day when the heart of the world skips a beat. Sorry, this is a very rough translation I did yesterday. So skips a beat or slows down and gathers in reverence before the stable of Bethlehem. Inside, the light of faith and love shines. The miracle takes place, and from the Divine Mother is born the Divine Child, the Son who will redeem the world. So it's a not very subtle linking of the Christian story with fascist ideas of motherhood. So Marina Duwiąy, she's discussed how Mussolini was eager to replace Catholicism with new fascist ideas and symbols and rituals of family life. And the Italian historian Emilio Gentile has also described fascism very famously as a kind of rival secular or political religion. However, I think we can see in sources like this and others how the regime built primarily on existing iconography of Catholic motherhood, with its emphasis on devotion, sacrifice, resignation, and the acceptance of loss, especially with regard to the male child. So the continuities with Catholicism are also very striking. And the metaphor is kind of, as I said, it's not very subtle. So if the Virgin Mary sacrificed her only child, the idea was that the fascist mother was also expected to bring up her son as a soldier for the nation. We can also see in the visual publicity for the Day of the Mother and Child how these very sentimental ideas about maternal love were also bound up with duty to the nation. So I've just selected 3 posters to give you an idea of how this works. So they're from 1935, 1937, and 1939. So when identifiable, you can see that the child is always pictured as male. I haven't come across any posters featuring a mother and a daughter. The 2 from the late 30s, so these 2 here, they show the progressive militarization of the iconography. So the middle poster, this one here, features a young child in the uniform of the Figlio della Lupa, or Wolf Child organization. So this was a sort of military-style organization that organized sports and military drilling for boys. And this poster, so this middle one is from 1935. So it followed the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, just earlier that year. So war was very much present in the national sort of consciousness at that time. The 1939 poster, as you can see, it depicts an older uniformed boy as well as a younger baby. And this time, the boy is also carrying some kind of weapon. So Italy didn't enter the war until June 1940, although it was clear in 1939, as everywhere, that war was imminent. And I think it's striking as well how in both instances where a baby is pictured, the mother and the baby meet each other's gaze directly, while the mothers direct their gaze away from the older uniformed sons, as if in recognition that they've essentially yielded them, at least in part, to the state. So while the military encroachment on the images and symbols of the Omni is clear in the late 30s and 40s, I think it's also important to remember the continuities with the pre- and post-fascist periods. Although set up under Mussolini, the Omni in reality mostly presided over a network of pre-existing local and Catholic-run institutions, so hospitals, foundling homes, and orphanages mainly. And they remained in existence as an organization until 1976, while the Day of the Mother and Child was celebrated mainly in the church and state-run orphanages and nurseries until the late 60s. It was only then that it was merged with Mother's Day, as it's now known, on the 9th of May, which was celebrated in Italy as a national festival since 1952, and sort of corresponds to sort of international idea of Mother's Day more directly. And the Italian president gave a national address on Mother and Child's Day in 1963. And I think you can see with the fact that this was still sort of, in 1963, this national day was still very much bound up with state ideas of duty and family, I think kind of shows us these continuities. So in 1963, those listening to the presidential address were told that the exhortation to love and protect children, which the UNMI makes to parents on this annual day of the mother and child, will resonate with a sense of responsibility felt by Italian mothers and fathers. So that's, even in the 1960s, this idea of the state kind of speaking to families and reminding them of their duties, both to family and to the state, I think, as I said, underlines these continuities. So finally, I wanted to ask how mothers themselves responded to these messages. It's difficult to gauge this with any measure of completeness, as you can imagine. But the sources that we do have suggest responses that range from feelings of distance and ambivalence to this fascist message to expressions of outright resentment. The demographic campaigns had very limited success in reversing the long-term decline in the national birth rate. So suggesting, first of all, that only a minority of families took seriously this idea of the large family model. On the eve of war in 1939, the Tuscan-based diarist Iris Arrigo reported a pregnant woman saying, "What's the use in having boys if they'll just take them away from me and kill them?" And fascists also noted the failure of their own propaganda by the end of the war, with one fascist magazine published in late 1943 blaming women for the Italian surrender earlier that year because of their reluctance to sacrifice their sons, their husbands, and brothers to the cause. So that even within the fascist regime, there's a sense in which people have not taken on these ideas. The left-wing historian Duÿ also carried out a quite extensive oral history project in the rural north of Italy between the 60s and the 80s. So he mainly interviewed people in the region of Piedmont, in the northwest of Italy. This was a region where Catholicism was quite deeply rooted, and rural poverty was also common up to the 60s. Piedmont also suffered quite a long and brutal Nazi occupation after 1943, so in the final sort of 18 months of the war, and consequently developed a strong anti-fascist resistance. So we have to keep that in mind when we hear from these women. The women interviewed by Ravelli in the 80s mostly began their families before the wars, and they described themselves as indifferent or opposed to fascism generally. Catholicism instead was the great constant of their lives. They almost all described saying the rosary as a family, and children were sort of accepted either with joy or with resignation, but seen as something that, children were something that happened in the context of marriage, and they would say things like, "Oh, it's God's plan for us to have large families," or whatever. They also described their sort of general resignation. This idea of it being women's lot to suffer and not complain came up a lot. Those who spoke of the war connected it to loss of brothers, husbands, and sons. And I've just pulled up two quotes that I found to put in the slide there. So one woman who lost her son in Russia in 1943, Lucia Abello, she said had quite strong things to say about the war. She said, "What did the war do to our children?" And she repeated it. "What did the war do to our children? It was a disaster. For what? For a whim." And then another woman, I found her quote striking in that, again, like many of them, she didn't mention any direct anti-fascist sentiment. At most, they described distance or ambivalence to fascism, but without naming fascism or politics, she describes a sort of anti-war sentiment. So this is Costanza Tolosano, and she says, this is the second quote, she says, "I've always asked myself, why is it always the poor devil they send to the front, and the rich man who stays back on the sidelines to save himself?" Just to give another couple of examples, in 1968, the oral historian Luisa Passerini carried out interviews among the working class inhabitants of Turin. And Turin, again, is in the Piedmont region, so nearby. And she interviewed them about their memories of life under fascism. So because socialism was strong among these people who were mainly workers in the Fiat factories, they were more likely to express open opposition to the regime. And for women, this was usually expressed in terms of their resistance to demographic policy. As urban women, they're also more likely to limit their family size, and they disliked anyway this kind of official encouragement to have larger families. So this is finally coming to the title quote here with these quotations. So one woman that Passerini spoke to, she said, "Oh, fascism, the Duce, Mussolini, have babies. Don't think of your husbands. Have babies. Give me babies to slaughter. He wanted boys to make war, and then he made it." And in the second quote, this one I particularly like, so Passerini asked this woman, Flora, how many children she had. And Flora said, "I had 3. I would have had more, but you didn't, to spite Mussolini, you see." So who knows what the actual reality was. I mean, it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I think it shows us how the regime's, these quotes show us how the regime's demographic policy kind of became its sort of sticking point in the relationship of these people, these women, with the state. Sorry, that's the end of my slides. Just to kind of look at the longer term sort of resonance of these ideas, we can see resonances in literature, first of all, where kind of this is literature that's written both during and after the fascist period. We can see examples of women tend to write not about sentimental mothers or happy families, they tend to write about sort of ambivalent mother figures or unsentimental mothers. So in literature, we can see this kind of quite concerted attempts to reject this idea of the loving fascist mother. And I think we can see resonances even going into the 70s. So discussions about motherhood in the 70s were not simply framed in terms of the dilemma about whether to become a mother. Discussions about motherhood, deciding whether to become a mother or not, they were not simply framed in terms of choice. The women of the feminists of the 70s tended to ground their activism in left-wing, often Marxist terms. And they argue that women should be free not just to decide whether to have children, but also to mother in the way that they chose. And this meant for them reorganizing society away from patriarchal and capitalist conditions that prevailed in the 70s, when the Cold War meant that a risk of new war was ever present. And we can see kind of in a lot of the feminist writings of the 70s, we can see this link between anti-war sentiments and feminism and sort of arguments for reproductive choice. So just to finish off, by taking a long perspective on the 20th century discourse of maternal love, I've tried to show how the fascist regime attempted to use both the rhetoric and the visual language of maternal love, which is already steeped, as we saw, in patriotic notions of duty and sacrifice, and deeply inflected by Catholic iconography, to mobilize mothers to produce sons for the nation. As a politics of the emotions rather than ideas, Mussolini was superficially successful in creating a new language and rituals of maternal love that resonated because they drew on much that was familiar. Yet a closer look at sources ranging from novels to oral histories and feminist manifestos show that actual responses range between indifference, ambivalence, and resentment. Although the 1935 invasion of Ethiopia enjoyed some measure of support, when it came to war again in 1940, Italians were ultimately unwilling to give up their sons to fight. And a new politics of anti-fascism and feminism took root after 1945 that essentially grounded opposition to fascism and later feminism in an understanding that children belonged not to the state, but to their parents.